There was a time when almost every garden had a plant that modern people now walk past without a second glance. It wasn't exotic, it wasn't rare, it wasn't expensive. And yet, for centuries, it was considered one of the most powerful plants a household could grow. Before laboratories, before pharmaceuticals, before synthetic treatments, people relied on what grew near their doors. And among those plants, tansy held a reputation that today feels almost unbelievable. Not because it was gentle, not because it was mild, but because it was strong, sometimes dangerously so. Tansy wasn't a forgotten weed, it was a deliberate choice. You could find it growing behind cottages, along fences, near animal pens, and in monastery gardens across Europe. Farmers knew it, healers respected it, and families understood one thing very clearly. This was not a plant to use casually. Its bright yellow button-like flowers looked cheerful, almost harmless, but its scent told a different story. Sharp, bitter, medicinal. A smell that insects avoided instinctively and animals learned to stay away from. That alone should tell you something. In traditional herbal systems, tansy was never treated like a daily tea or a comfort herb. It was used sparingly, intentionally, and with knowledge passed down through generations. People didn't experiment with it, they followed rules. Historically, tansy was associated with cleansing, not in a modern wellness sense, but in a practical, survival-based one. It was used in times when parasites, pests, and infestations were part of everyday life. Humans dealt with them, animals dealt with them, homes dealt with them, and tansy was part of that defense. Bundles of tansy were hung in houses to repel insects. Fresh leaves were rubbed on doorways, windows, and bedding. Dried plants were placed among stored grains and clothing. Not because someone thought it might help, but because people observed over and over again that it worked. In livestock traditions, tansy had a reputation that bordered on fear. Farmers knew it affected internal systems strongly. That knowledge came with strict limits. Too little did nothing, too much caused harm. So its use was controlled, seasonal, and deliberate. What makes tansy so different from many other plants is its chemistry. Even without understanding molecules or compounds, people recognized its potency. It wasn't a plant you drank daily. It was a plant you used briefly, then stopped. That pattern alone separates it from most gentle herbs. Over time, as industrial agriculture and medicine expanded, tansy slowly disappeared from common conversation. Not because it stopped being effective, but because it didn't fit into a world that prefers standardized doses and simplified solutions. Tansy doesn't behave predictably across all situations. Its strength varies with soil, climate, and growth stage. That made it unsuitable for mass use, but perfectly suited for traditional knowledge. Modern comparisons often try to frame old plants against modern treatments. That's where confusion begins. Traditional remedies were never meant to replace modern medicine in a one-to-one way. They existed in a completely different system of thinking. People didn't ask, is this stronger than that? They asked, does this solve the problem we are facing right now? And for centuries, tansy answered that question in specific, limited, and respected ways. One of the reasons tansy is rarely discussed today is safety. Traditional healers emphasized caution. This plant was not for children, not for pregnant women, not for long-term use. Knowledge of its limits was as important as knowledge of its benefits. When that cultural memory faded, the plant itself became labeled as dangerous rather than powerful. And once a plant gains that reputation, it's easier to forget it than to explain it. But forgetting doesn't erase history. In many old texts, tansy appears alongside other plants now considered essential to herbal tradition. It wasn't fringe knowledge, it was mainstream, just handled carefully. Another reason tansy disappeared is that modern life removed many of the problems it once addressed. Controlled environments, processed food, sanitation, and veterinary medicine reduced the everyday threats people once faced. When the problem fades, so does the tool, yet the plant never left. Tansy still grows easily. It thrives in poor soil. It resists pests. It survives cold winters and hot summers. It spreads quietly, almost as if it remembers its role. Gardeners who grow tansy today often do so for non-medicinal reasons: companion planting, insect deterrence, or historical gardens. And even then, they notice something interesting. Insects avoid it. Animals avoid it. Other plants nearby often show reduced pest damage. Those observations echo the past. What made tansy valuable was never mystery or magic. It was consistency. Generation after generation noticed the same effects and learned the same cautions. And that's the part most people forget. Traditional remedies weren't casual. They were disciplined. Tansy represents a kind of knowledge modern society struggles with. The idea that something can be useful and dangerous at the same time. That power requires responsibility, not hype. So when people say, why doesn't anyone talk about Tansy anymore? The answer is simple. It demands respect, it demands context, and it refuses to be simplified. In a world that prefers quick answers and safe slogans, Tansy doesn't fit. But for those who study traditional gardens, historical medicine, and old survival systems, Tansy still stands quietly in the background. Not forgotten, just waiting for people who understand that power without wisdom is never progress. And sometimes the plants we stop talking about are the ones that remind us how careful our ancestors had to be, and how much they truly knew. 2. Wormwood. If Tansy was the sharp blade, sudden, decisive, and unforgiving, wormwood was the long knife that stayed in the hand. Wormwood didn't shock the system. It worked through repetition, rhythm, and persistence. That distinction shaped how entire cultures viewed it. Where Tansy demanded precision and restraint, wormwood invited familiarity. Its bitterness became legendary. Across centuries, bitterness itself was described through wormwood. Writers didn't say something was bitter, and they said it was like wormwood. That metaphor survived long after the plant itself faded from everyday use. Unlike Tansy, wormwood rarely stood alone. It appeared blended, layered, and adjusted. Small amounts, regular intervals, long traditions of measured use. This made it adaptable. And adaptability is what allowed wormwood to travel across borders, climates, and belief systems. In monasteries, wormwood was cultivated methodically. In rural villages, it grew wild but was harvested carefully. In trade routes, it appeared dried, powdered, infused. It became part of systems, not just remedies. Compared to Tansy's short, intense presence, wormwood stayed. That staying power mattered when formal medicine began to take shape. Plants that could be diluted, repeated, and documented survived the transition. Plants that required intuition and restraint often did not. Old healers understood this difference intuitively. Wormwood was considered forgiving. Mistakes could be corrected, doses adjusted. Time allowed learning. Tansy allowed no such comfort. This is why wormwood was often described as the first response. Not because it was weaker, but because it allowed room for error. And in traditional knowledge, forgiveness was a form of safety. Wormwood's role was not to end a process, but to begin one. 3. Black walnut. Black walnut entered traditional awareness differently. It wasn't ancient folklore that elevated it, it was observation. People noticed what happened when black walnut hulls were handled. Skin darkened, fabric stained, tools marked. The plant left evidence behind. Nothing about it was subtle. That staining became symbolic. If a plant could mark wood and cloth so deeply, people believed it could reach deeply as well. Compared to Tansy's sudden force, black walnut felt slow and deliberate. Its effects unfolded over time. Where Tansy struck like lightning, black walnut moved like water. Persistent, shaping, inevitable. This difference influenced trust. Some traditions preferred black walnut precisely because it didn't rush. It gave the body time to respond. Others avoided it because its presence lingered, and lingering power made people uneasy. Black walnut demanded commitment. Once you started, you couldn't pretend nothing happened. That stands in contrast to wormwood, which could be paused, adjusted, or discontinued with relative ease. Black walnut stayed in the system, symbolically and practically. This made it both respected and feared. The comparison between Tansy and black walnut reveals something essential about traditional thinking. Strength wasn't measured only by intensity, it was measured by how long the effect remained. A sudden storm passes. Erosion reshapes the land forever. Both are powerful, but only one changes the future quietly. 4. Garlic feels humble, and that humility is its secret. While Tansy stood at the edges of gardens and wormwood occupied a middle ground, garlic lived at the center of daily life. It crossed boundaries effortlessly. Food, flavor, protection, ritual, medicine, superstition. It did everything, softly. Garlic wasn't respected because it was dramatic. It was respected because it never left. Day after day it appeared on tables. Year after year it was planted again. Generation after generation, knowledge passed without ceremony. No warnings, no rituals, no fear. Compared to tansy, garlic was gentle. Compared to wormwood, it was nourishing. Compared to black walnut, it was forgiving. Its power came from accumulation. Traditional cultures understood something modern thinking often misses. Not all effectiveness needs intensity. Some power comes from constancy. Garlic didn't demand attention. It didn't signal danger. It didn't draw lines. That's why garlic became socially acceptable, and tansy did not. Tansy required restraint. Garlic rewarded habit. When modern people try to compare old plants to modern solutions, they often ignore this fundamental difference. Tansy was never meant to be used daily. Wormwood was meant to be respected. Black walnut demanded commitment. Garlic simply asked to be present. And presence over time reshapes systems quietly. Both tansy and garlic worked, but they worked in opposite philosophies. One corrected sharply, the other supported endlessly. That contrast explains why one disappeared from kitchens, and the other never left. 5. Rue may be the closest philosophical mirror to tansy, not because it acts the same way, but because it demands the same kind of respect. Rue was never a casual plant. From the moment it entered a garden, it carried meaning. It wasn't planted for beauty alone, nor for abundance. It was planted for presence. Historically, rue stood at thresholds, near doors, along borders, beside paths. Where tansy marked limits in action, rue marked limits in awareness. Rue was associated with vision, not the kind measured by clarity of sight, but by perception. It was believed to sharpen discernment, to heighten sensitivity to imbalance. In some traditions, rue was used before important decisions, rituals, or transitions, not to force change, but to notice it. Tansy, by contrast, was used when noticing was no longer enough. That distinction mattered deeply. In symbolic language, rue warned you something was wrong. Tansy corrected what had already crossed the line. Because of this, the two plants were rarely combined without purpose. Old gardeners understood that stacking powerful influences wasn't strength. It was recklessness. Power was managed through separation. Rue had its place. Tansy had its moment. Even their growth habits reflected this philosophy. Rue grows woody, slow, and persistent. It doesn't rush. It doesn't spread aggressively. It stays where it is planted and asks to be approached deliberately. Tansy spreads freely. It fills space. It doesn't wait for permission. Putting them side by side symbolized imbalance unless guided by knowledge and intent. Traditional systems weren't afraid of strong plants. They were afraid of careless combinations. That mindset has almost completely disappeared. Today, plants are often judged individually, stripped of context. But historically, meaning came from relationships, where a plant grew, what it grew near, and when it was used. Rue and tansy were not enemies. They were sentinels stationed at different points along the same boundary. Why tansy was left behind. When modern medicine emerged, it didn't reject plants. It filtered them. What survived were species that could be simplified. Plants that worked gently. Plants that tolerated variation. Plants that forgave mistakes. Tansy did none of that. Its strength varied by soil, season, and weather. Its effectiveness depended on timing, restraint, and cultural understanding. Its safety relied on knowledge that could not be written into a label. Modern systems require predictability. Dosage must be fixed. Effects must be isolated. Responsibility must be transferable. Tansy refused to comply. It didn't behave like a substance. It behaved like a relationship. And relationships don't scale well. So tansy faded from manuals, curricula, and public discussion. Not because it stopped working, but because it demanded too much understanding. Plants like garlic stayed because they were gentle. Plants like wormwood stayed because they could be adjusted. Plants like black walnut stayed because their effects were slow and measurable. Tansy stayed only in memory and in the soil. Even now it grows without invitation. Along fences, near ruins, at the edges of old homesteads. It doesn't ask to be replanted, it simply returns. That persistence is not accidental. Tansy doesn't need rediscovery, it needs remembrance. It belongs to a time when knowledge was held carefully, passed quietly, and applied with restraint. A time when power wasn't celebrated, it was managed. Modern thinking often assumes that what disappears becomes irrelevant. Traditional thinking understood the opposite. Some things withdraw because the environment no longer knows how to hold them safely. Tansy didn't vanish. It stepped back. And perhaps that restraint, that refusal to be simplified, is its most powerful trait of all. Not every plant wants to be popular. Some only remain for those willing to relearn caution itself.